The city was a labyrinth of flickering lights and darkened alleyways, the kind of place where shadows stretched long into the night and every corner whispered secrets. It was late, the hour when the city's true face emerged, dark, empty, yet teeming with the pulse of its underbelly. The world outside her window felt distant, detached, like a fading dream. Anna was used to this. She had spent years in the silence of the night, watching the world from the fringes, never fully part of it, but always there, always aware. Her life was a series of carefully constructed moments, an endless cycle of performing, pretending, surviving. The phone buzzed on her coffee table and she picked it up with a practiced ease. A name she didn't recognize lit up the screen. Another client, another request. The message was simple enough: a booking for tonight. Her fingers swiped the screen and she skimmed the details, her mind already moving ahead. The job was the same as always, a faceless transaction, a performance she had learned to perfect. The words were nothing new: "I'll pay well, just meet me at the usual place." But as she read the message, something gnawed at the back of her mind. There was a strange weight in the air, a quiet tension she couldn't quite shake. She'd felt it before in passing glances and hushed whispers, but tonight it felt different. The unease swirled around her, tightening like a noose, yet she pushed it aside. It was just another job, after all. She stood up, the familiar weight of her black dress settling against her skin. She knew this dress like the back of her hand. It was the one she wore when she needed to be someone else, someone more alluring, more distant. She checked her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her makeup just a bit more, ensuring her look was flawless. Perfection was the key to survival. A quick glance at the clock confirmed it time to go. Outside, the night air bit at her skin as she stepped into the cold, but it was the kind of cold that reminded her of her own detachment from the world. She was a ghost here, moving through the streets, unseen, unnoticed. And yet, she knew that there was a hidden power in being invisible. Tonight, she was merely a tool to be used and discarded. The city wrapped itself around her like a shroud as she walked toward the waiting cab. The hum of the engine was familiar, comforting even. It was the sound of another night, another job, and in some strange way, it felt like home. She pushed aside the flicker of doubt and stared out the window as the city sped by, fading into the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so she thought. The phone rang just as the cab pulled away from the curb, its tone sharp and insistent. She answered before it could ring again, her fingers moving automatically, but the voice on the other end of the line made her freeze. It wasn't like the usual calls, it wasn't warm, it wasn't polite. It was unsettling. "I need you," the voice said, its cadence smooth and dark, almost mechanical. There was no hesitation in the words, no room for negotiation, and something about it made her skin crawl. She had heard all kinds of voices in her line of work, desperate, eager, sometimes downright desperate, but this one felt different. It was too calm, too controlled. It felt like it was waiting, as if the person on the other end knew exactly what she would do. There was a brief silence on the line before he continued, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Meet me at the usual place. I'll be waiting." She didn't respond right away, her thoughts swirling like a storm inside her head. The request was simple enough. It wasn't the request that bothered her. It was the way he said it, the way the words hung in the air like a threat. The chill in her chest deepened, but she couldn't afford to let that show. She was a professional, after all. The cab turned down a narrow street, its headlights illuminating the darkness around her. She had been here before, countless times. The location was nothing new. But tonight, there was something different about it, an invisible weight in the air that made her feel like she was walking into a trap. The streets felt colder than usual, the shadows darker, stretching longer as if they were reaching for her. She pushed the feeling aside as she paid the driver and stepped out of the cab. The building loomed in front of her, an old structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The door was already open when she arrived, as if someone had been expecting her. She hesitated for only a second before walking in. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the walls lined with peeling paint and faded wallpaper. It looked like a place lost in time, as though no one had bothered to care for it in decades. It was the perfect place for something wrong. And yet, she walked forward, deeper into the building, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The door at the end of the hallway was cracked open, and a dark figure stood in the shadows. His presence filled the room, his very being imposing. But she couldn't see his face. Not yet. She stepped into the room, and the door clicked shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The figure standing in the darkness shifted slightly, and for the first time, she saw him tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially hidden in the shadows. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated his features, but it was enough to send a chill crawling under her skin. "You came," he said, his voice low and almost amused, though it carried a certain edge that she couldn't ignore. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had dealt with all kinds of clients in her time, but this one was different. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, about the way his eyes seemed to track her every movement, even in the darkness. She felt his gaze on her like a weight, heavy and suffocating. "I'm not here to play games," she said, her voice sounding more confident than she felt. But even as the words left her mouth, she could feel her heart racing in her chest. The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow. There was no rush, no urgency. He seemed to enjoy the tension in the air, savoring it. The distance between them closed with each step, and she could feel his presence growing stronger, more overwhelming. "You're afraid, aren't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Now you should be." The words sent a jolt of fear through her, though she refused to show it. She had faced danger before, but there was something in this man that made her feel like she was in way over her head. There was no escape from him. She could sense it. This wasn't a simple transaction. This wasn't a normal job. She was in the presence of something much darker, something more dangerous than she had ever encountered. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, and the touch felt like ice. Her skin prickled with the sensation of it, and she jerked away instinctively, but he was already too close. His presence was suffocating, and for the first time, she felt the real fear she had only ever read about in books. "Don't worry," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll let you go. But you'll never forget me." Her heart was hammering in her chest, each beat like a drum of panic. She had to get out. Now! Her mind raced as she looked for an exit, any way to break free from the suffocating grip of this man. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. There was something about him that made her skin crawl, something unnatural in his eyes, something that made her feel like prey in the presence of a predator. She glanced toward the door. It was too far. He was too close. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, and the room seemed to close in on her. He was watching her with a look of amusement, like he knew exactly what she was thinking. She could feel his gaze boring into her, and she knew that the more she resisted, the more dangerous he would become. But she couldn't stay. She couldn't let him have power over her. Not again. Suddenly he stepped back, giving her just enough space to make a break for it. But the moment she moved, he spoke, his voice cold and final. "Leave if you want," he said, his tone almost bored now. "But remember, not everyone is as easy to escape from as I am." His words were like a whisper in the back of her mind as she bolted for the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled with the handle, her fingers slick with sweat, her pulse pounding in her ears. When the door finally gave way, she didn't hesitate. She ran. Out of the room, down the hall, through the building, and out into the cold night air. Her legs burned with the effort, but she didn't stop, didn't even look back. The city loomed ahead, its lights flickering like distant stars, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching her. His words echoed in her mind, a warning that she could never forget. She kept running faster now, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from him. The fear still clung to her, but she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was alive, and that for now was enough.